John and Yo were lying in bed with the lights off because it was too hot to have them on or to be afoot. John's hand slipped down to her hips, beating a beat. "It's too hot," Yo said, silencing it. He tried to humor her, playing on a new nickname. "Not tonight, Josephine." He turned on his side to face her and outlined her features in the dark. He traced the heart line from her chin to her forehead and down again. He kissed her chin to seal the valentine. "Beautiful. Do you know your face is a perfect heart?" He discovered this every time he wanted to make love to her. The valentine was too hot. "I'm sweating," it moaned. "Don't." The hand wouldn't listen. The middle finger traced a heart on her lips. The pinky shaped a heart on the fleshiness above her right breast. "Please, John." His fingertips felt like rolling beads of sweat. "John, please," he echoed. He printed JOHN on her right breast with a sticky finger as if he were branding her his. "John. It's too hot." She appealed to his common sense. "John, it's too hot," he whined. The combination of heat and thwarted desire made him nasty. She stoppered his mouth with her hand. He ignored the violence in the gesture and kissed her moist palm. His eyes lidded with hopefulness, he rolled towards her, his body making a sucking sound as it unglued itself from the bare mattress. The sheets had drooped from their hospital corners, they wilted onto the floor. John's right hand played piano on her ribs, and his mouth blew a piccolo on her breasts. "Shit," she yelled at him, leaping out of bed. "Fuck." He had forced her to say her least favorite word in the world. She would never ever forgive him for that. "Ever," he said, angrily grabbing for her arm in the dark. "Ever." Her heart folded, flattened, folded again. The halves fluttered, blinked, and opened. Her heart lifted up to the cloud flowers in the sky. "Ever." She slapped him with the sound. "Ever. Ever." She wished she had her clothes on. It was strange to make absolute statements in the nude. He came home with a bouquet of flowers that she knew he had paid too much for. They were blue, and she guessed they were irises. Isis was her favorite name for flowers, so they had to be irises. But as he handed them to her, she could not make out his words. They were clean, bright sounds, but they meant nothing to her. "What are you trying to say?" she kept asking. He spoke kindly, but in a language she had never heard before. She pretended she understood. She took a big smell of the flowers. "Thank you, love." At the word love, her hands itched so fiercely that she was afraid she would drop the flowers. He said something happily, again in sounds she could not ascribe meanings to. "Come on, love," she asked his eyes. She spoke precisely as if she were talking to a foreigner or a willful child. "John, can you understand me?" She nodded her head to let him know that he should answer her by nodding his head if words failed him. He shook his head, "No." She held him steady with both hands as if she were trying to nail him down into her world. "John," she pleaded. "Please, love." He pointed to his ears and nodded. Volume wasn't the problem. He could hear her. Babble babble. His lips were slow motion on each syllable. "He is saying hove you," she thought. "Babble," she mimicked him. "Babble babble babble babble." Maybe that meant, "love you too," in whatever tongue he was speaking. He pointed to her, to himself. "Babble." She nodded wildly. Her valentine hairline, the heart in her ribs and all the ones on her sleeves twinkled like the pincers of the crab in the sky. Maybe now they could start over, in silence. When she left her husband, Yo wrote a note, "I'm going to my folks till my head/heart clear." She revised the note, "I'm needing some space, some time, until my head/heart/soul no. She didn't want to divide herself anymore, 3 persons in one yo. "John," she began, then she jotted a little triangle before John. Dear, she wrote on a slant. She had read in a handwriting analysis book that this was the style of the self-assured. Dear John, listen, we both know it's not working. LTSV, he would ask. It's, meaning what? Yo crossed the vague pronoun out. We are not working. You know it, I know it, we both know it, oh John, John, John. Her hand kept writing, automatically, until the page was filled with the dark ink of his name. She tore the note up and conf-ed it over her head, a rainfall of John's. She wrote him a short memo, gone then added to my folks. She thought of signing it, Yolanda, but her real name no longer sounded like her own, so instead she scribbled his name for her, Joe. Her parents were worried. She talked too much, yacked all the time. She talked in her sleep, she talked when she ate despite 27 years of teaching her to keep her mouth shut when she chewed. She talked in comparisons, she spoke in riddles. She ranted, her mother said to her father. Her father coughed, upset. She quoted famous lines of poetry and the opening sentences of the classics. How could anyone remember so much? Her mother asked her sullen father. She was carried away with the sound of her voice, her mother diagnosed. She quoted Frost, she misquoted Stevens, she paraphrased Rilke's description of love. Can you hear me? Dr. Payne held his hands up to his mouth like a megaphone and made believe he was yelling over a great distance. Can you hear me? She quoted to him from Rumi, she sang what she knew of Mary Had a Little Lamb, mixing it up with BAA, Black Sheep. The doctor thought it best if she checked into a small, private facility where he could keep an eye on her. For her own good. Round-the-clock care, nice grounds, arts and crafts classes, tennis courts, a friendly, unintimidating staff, no one in a uniform. Her parents signed the papers for your own good / they quoted the nice doctor to her. Her mother held her while a nurse camouflaged in street clothes filled a syringe. Yo quoted from Don Quixote in the original, she translated the passage on prisoners into instantaneous English. The nurse stung her with an injection of tears. Yo went quiet for the first time in months, then burst into tears. The nurse rubbed a tiny cloud on her arm. Please, honey, don't cry, her mother pleaded with her. Let her cry, the doctor advised. It's a good sign, a very good sign. Tears, tears, Joe said, reciting again, tears from the depths of some profound despair. Don't worry, the doctor said, coaching the alarmed parents. It's just a poem. But men die daily for lack of what is found there, Yo quoted and misquoted, drowning in the flooded streams of her consciousness. The signs got better. Yo fantasized about Doc. He would save her body / mind / soul by taking all the slashes out, making her one whole Yolanda. She talked to him about growth and fear and the self in transition and women's spiritual quest. She told him everything except that she was falling in love with him. Was she ready for her parents? He asked. Ready for her parents, she echoed. Her parents stepped into the room, staging happiness. They tested her with questions about the food, the doctor, the weather, and the tile ashtray she had made in arts and crafts therapy. She offered it to her mother. Her mother cried. I shouldn't cry. It's a good sign, Yo said, quoting Doc, then caught herself. Quoting others again, a bad sign. Her father moved to the window and checked the sky. When are you coming home? The back asked Yo. Whenever she's ready to. Her mother parted the hair from Yo's forehead. And the Valentine appeared again on the earth. I love you guys, Yo improvised. So what if her first original words in months were the most hackneyed? They were her own truth. I do, she sing-sang. Her mother looked a little worried as if she had bitten into something sour she had thought would be sweet. What happened, Yo? Her mother asked the hand she was patting a little later. We thought you and John were so happy. We just didn't speak the same language, Yo said, simplifying. Yolanda. Her mother pronounced her name in Spanish, her pure, mouth-filling, full-blooded name, Yolanda. But then, it was inevitable, like gravity, like night and day, little apple bites when God's back is turned, her name fell, bastardized, breaking into a half-dozen nicknames. Pobrecita Yasita, another nickname. We love you. Her mother said it loud enough for two people's worth. Don't we, Poppy? Don't we what, Mommy? Yo's father turned. Love her, his wife snapped. There's no question at all. Poppy came towards Mommy, or Yo. What is love? Yo asks Dr. Pain, the skin on her neck prickles and reddens. She has developed a random allergy to certain words. She does not know which ones, until they are on the tip of her tongue and it is too late. Her lips swell, her skin itches, her eyes water with allergic reaction tears. The doctor studies her and smells the backs of his fingers. What do you think it is, Joe? Love. I don't know. She tries to look him in the eyes, but she is afraid if she does, he will know, he will know. Oh, Joe, he consoles, we constantly have to redefine the things that are important to us. It's okay not to know. When you find yourself in love again, you'll know what it is. Love, Yo murmurs, testing. Sure enough, the skin on her arm erupts into an ugly rash. I guess you're right. She itches. It's just scary not to know what the most important word in my vocabulary means. Don't you think that's the challenge of being alive? Alive, she echoes, as if she were relapsing to her old quote. Ing days. Her lips burn. Alive, love, words she can use now only at a cost. Yo's finger traces Doc's body on the metallic screen of the window as if she were making him up. Maybe she will try writing again, nothing too ambitious, a fun poem in the limerick mode. She'll call it, Dennis Racket / playing on the double meaning of the word racket as well as on his last name, Pain. Deep within her, something stirs, an itch she can't get to. Indigestion, she murmurs, patting her belly. Perhaps not, she thinks, perhaps it is a personality phenomenon, the real Yolanda resurrecting on an August afternoon above the kempt green lawns of this private facility. Her stomach hurts. She strokes white I am hungry circles on her hospital smock. But the beating inside her is more desperate than hunger, a moth wild inside a lampshade. It rises, a thrashing of wings, up through her trachea until Yo retches. How tragic. At her age to die of a broken heart attack. She tries to laugh, but instead of laughter, she feels ticklish wings unfolding like a fan at the base of her throat. They spread her mouth open as if she were screaming a name out over a great distance. A huge, black bird springs out, it perches on her bureau, looking just like the etching of the raven in Yo's first English poetry book. She holds out her hand to befriend the dark bird. It ignores her, and looks philosophically out the window at the darkening sky. Slowly its wings lift and fall, huge arcs rise and collapse, up and down, up and down. Her hair is blown about her face. Dust hurries to corners. Curtains set sail from their windows. It flies towards the window. Oh my God. The screen. Yo remembers in a moment of suspension of belief. Have a little faith, she coaches herself, as the dark shape floats easily through the screen like smoke or clouds or figments of any sort. Out it flies, delighting in its newfound freedom, its dark hooded beak and tiny head drooping like its sex between arching wings. Suddenly it stops midair. Delight and surprise are written all over its wing grin. It plummets down towards the sunning man on the lawn. Beak first, a dark and secret complex, a personality disorder let loose on the world, it plunges. Oh no, Yo wails. No, not him. She had thought that alone at her window on an August afternoon she would be far from where she could do any harm. And now, down it dives towards the one man she most wants, immune to her words. Yo screams as the hook beak rips at the man's shirt and chest. The white figure on the lawn is a red sop. Satiated, the dark bird rises and joins a rolling cluster of rain clouds in the northern sky. Yo bangs on the screen. The man looks up, trying to guess a window. Who is that? Are you all right? She cries out, liking her role as unidentified voice from the heavens. Who is that? He stands, grabs the beach towel. The blood congeals into a long, red terry cloth rectangle. Who is it? He is annoyed at the prolonged guessing game. A secret admirer, she trills. God. Heather, he guesses. Yolanda, she murmurs to herself. Yo, she shouts down at him. Who the hell is Heather, she wonders. Oh, Joe. He laughs, waving his racket. Her lips prickle and pucker. Oh no, she thinks, recognizing the first signs of her allergy. Not my own name. 111, the lawn is green and clean and quiet. Love, Yo enunciates, letting the full force of the word loose in her mouth. She is determined to get over this allergy. She will build immunity to the offending words. She braces herself for a double dose. Love, love, she says the words quickly. Her face is one itchy Valentine. Amor. Even in Spanish, the word makes a rash erupt on the backs of her hands. Inside her ribs, her heart is an empty nest. Love. She rounds the sound of the word as if it were an egg to put into it. Yolanda. She puts in another one. She looks up at the thunder clouds. His tennis game is going to be rain-checked, all right. There isn't a sample of blue up there to remind her of the sky. So she says, blue. She searches for the right word to follow the blue of blue. Cry why sky. She gains faith as she says each word, and dares further, world. Squirrel rough tough love enough. The words tumble out, making a sound like the rumble of distant thunder, taking shape, depth, and substance. Yo continues, dock, rock, smock, luck, so many words. There is no end to what can be said about the world. The Rudy Elmanhurst story. Yolanda, we took turns being the wildest. First one, then another, of us would confess our sins on vacation nights after the parents went to bed, and we had double-checked the hall to make sure there were no moors on the coast, an island expression for the coast being clear. Baby sister Fifi held that title the longest, though Sandy, with her good looks and many opportunities, gave her some competition. Several times Carla, the responsible eldest, did something crazy. But she always claimed she had done whatever it was she'd done to gain ground for us all. So her reigns of error smacked of good intentions and were never as juicy as Fifi's. To our wow, Fifi, how could you? Fifi gave us bad girl grins and the catchphrase from the Alka-Seltzer commercial, try it, you'll like it. For a brief few giddy years, I was the one with the reputation among my sisters of being the wild one. I suppose it all started at boarding school when I began getting lots of callers, and though none of these beaux lasted long enough to even 86 be called relationships, my sisters mistook volume for vampishness. Back in those days I had what one teacher called the vivacious personality. I had to look up the word in the dictionary and was relieved to find out it didn't mean I had problems. English was then still a party favor for me. Crack open the dictionary, find out if I'd just been insulted, praised, admonished, criticized. Those shy prep school guys at mixers with their endearing long hands and blushing complexions, I could make them laugh. I could make them believe they had really engaged a girl in conversation. There wasn't a Saturday afternoon or Sunday after morning service that I didn't have callers. A bunch of guys from our brother school would come down the hill and hang out in our parlor to get away from their dormitories, maybe sneaking a cigarette or a swig from a flask on the walk over. At our front desk, They had to give a girl's name, and quite a few gave mine. This had nothing to do with my being attractive in any remarkable way. This was vivaciousness through and through. When I went away to college, my vivaciousness ultimately worked against me. I'd meet someone, conversation would flow, they'd come calling, but pretty soon afterwards, just as my heart was beginning to throw out little tendrils of attachment, they'd leave. I couldn't keep them interested. Why I couldn't keep them interested was pretty simple, I wouldn't sleep with them. By the time I went to college, it was the late 60s, and everyone was sleeping around as a matter of principle. By then, I was a lapsed Catholic, my sisters and I had been pretty well Americanized since our arrival in this country a decade before, so really, I didn't have a good excuse. Why I didn't just sleep with someone as persistent as Rudy Elmenhurst is a mystery I'm exploring here by picking it apart the way we learned to do to each other's poems and stories in the English class where I met Rudolf Broderman Elmenhurst, III. Rudolf Broderman Elmenhurst, III, didn't show up until 10 minutes or so into the class. I, on the other hand, had been the first to arrive, selecting a place around the seminar table close to the door, but unfortunately since the table was round, equally exposed. Others strolled in, the English jocks at the school. I knew they were special from their jeans and t-shirts, their knowing, ironic looks when obscure works of literature were referred to. The girls didn't all knit during class like education and socio majors. I'd already been writing on my own for a while, but this was my first English class since I'd talked my parents into letting me transfer to this co-ed college last fall. At my place around the seminar table I unpacked my notebook and every one of the required and recommended texts which I had already bought, stacking them in front of me like my credentials. Most of the other students were too cool to have done anything hasty like purchase the books for the course. The professor walked in, a young guy in a turtleneck and jacket, the uniform of the with it professors of the day. He had that edge of the untenured, too eager, too many hand-outs, too many please feel frees on his syllabus, a home number as well as an office number. He called roll, acknowledging most of the other students with nicknames and jokes and remarks, stumbling over my name and smiling falsely at me, a smile I had identified as one flashed on foreign students to show them the natives were friendly. I felt profoundly out of place. The only person I seemed to have anything in common with was the absent Rudolf Broderman Elmenhurst, III, who also had an odd name and who was out of it because he wasn't there. We were into the logistics of how to make copies for workshops when a young man walked in, late. He was one of those guys who has just come through a bout of adolescent acne into a scarred, masculine, bad boy face. A guy to be passed over by the beauties in our class looking for sweethearts. He had an ironic smile on his lips, and a phrase I haven't heard in a while: bedroom eyes. A guy who would break your heart. But you wouldn't know all this if you went by the sound of his name, which I did, an immigrant's failing, literalism. I assumed he was late because he'd just whizzed in from his small barony somewhere in Austria. The professor stopped the class. Rudolf Broderman Elmenhurst, III, I presume. Everybody laughed, this guy too. I admired that from the start, to be able to make such an entrance without blushing and stumbling and arraying the floor with your books and the contents of your pocketbook. He could take a joke, and put on such an ironic self-assured face no one felt bad laughing. The guy looked around and there was a space next to the territory I'd carved out for myself on the table with my pile of books. He came and sat down. I could tell he was looking me over, probably wondering who the hell I was, this intruder upon the sanctuary of English majors. Class resumed. The professor started explaining again about what all he expected from us in the course. Later, he asked us to write down a response to a little poem he passed around. This guy with a name like a title leaned over and asked if I could lend him a piece of paper and a pen. I felt honored to be the one asked. I tore some pages out of my notebook, then rummaged in my pocketbook for another pen. I looked up with a sorry-eyed expression. I don't have an extra pen, I whispered, complete sentences for whispers, that's what tells you I was still a greenhorn in this culture. This guy looked at me as if he didn't give a damn about a pen, and I was a fool to think so. It was such an intense look, I felt myself coloring. That's okay, he mouthed, without really using his voice, so I had to lip read, his full lips puckering as if he were throwing little kisses at me. If I'd known what sexy feelings felt like, I would have identified the shiver going down my spine and into my legs. He turned to his other neighbor, who didn't have a pen either. The word went round. Anyone have an extra pen? No one. There was a dearth of pens that day in class. I sunk my hand back into my pocketbook. I was the proverbially overprepared student, I had to have a standby writing utensil. I felt something promising at the bottom of my purse and pulled it out. It was a teensy pencil from a monogrammed set my mother had given me for Christmas, a box of pencils my color, red, and inscribed with my so-called name in gold letters, Fallen Dot. My mother had tried for my own name Yolanda, but the company had substituted the Americanized, Southernized Jolinda, Fallen Dot, that's what this pencil used to say. In fact, it was so worn down, only the hook of the slash was left. We didn't throw things away in my family. I used both sides of a piece of paper. I handed my find over to this guy. He took it and held it up as if to say, "What have we here?" His buddies around us chuckled. I felt shabby for having saved a pencil through so many sharpenings. At the end of class, I fled before he could turn around and give it back to me. That night there was a knock on my door. I was in my nightgown already, doing our assignment, a love poem in the form of a sonnet. I'd been reading it out loud pretty dramatically, trying to get the accents right, so I felt embarrassed to be caught. I asked who it was. I didn't recognize the name. Rudy. The guy who borrowed your pencil, the voice said through the closed door. Strange, I thought, 10:30 at night. I hadn't caught on yet to some of the strategies. Did I wake you up? He wanted to know when I opened the door. No, I said, laughing apologetically. This guy I had sworn never to talk to after he had embarrassed me in class, but my politeness training ran on automatic. I excused myself for not asking him in. I'm doing my homework. That wasn't an excuse in the circles he ran in. We stood at the door a long moment, he looking over my shoulder into my room for an invitation. I just came to return your pencil. He held it out, a small red stub in his palm. Just to return that? I said, calling his bluff. He grinned, dimples making parenthesis at the corners of his lips as if his smile were a secret between us. Yeah, he said, and again he had that intent look in his eye, and again he looked over my shoulder. I picked the pencil out of his palm and was glad it had been sharpened to a stub so he couldn't see my name in gold letters inscribed on the side. Thank you, I said, shifting my weight on my feet and touching the doorknob. Little moves, polite preliminaries to closing the door. He spoke up. Can we have lunch sometime? Sure, we can have lunch, sometime. The way I emphasized sometime, it was hopeless. I didn't trust this guy, I didn't know how to read him. I had nothing in my vocabulary of human behavior to explain him. 10 minutes late to the first meeting of a class. I knock myself out to get him a pencil and he makes fun. 10:30, he shows up at my door to return it, and asks me to have lunch with him. How about tomorrow before class, Rudy said. We don't have class tomorrow. That gives us time for a long lunch, he answered, real quick on his feet. I couldn't help being impressed. Okay, I said, shaking my head. Tomorrow, lunch. We had lunch the next day, talked until supper, and then had supper. That's the way I remember relationships starting in college, those obsessive marathon beginnings. It was hard to go back to your little dorm room and do your homework after having been so absorbed in someone else. But that's just what I did. I went back and worked on my sonnet. It was a 14-line treatise on the nature of love, but the whole time I was writing down my abstractions, I was thinking about how Rudy listened, looking at my mouth, so that it was hard for me to pay attention to what I was saying. How he puckered his lips as if he were kissing each word goodbye. How his hand had touched the small of my back to steer me through a crowd of rowdy frat guys in the dining room. If we admire some people for their originality with words, others for their quirky interesting minds, then Rudy had to be admired for his sexy, instinctive way with his body. He was the kind of guy who could kiss you behind your ear and make you feel like you just had kinky sex. The next day Rudy didn't turn in his sonnet. After class, while I packed up my luggage of school books, I heard him talking to the professor how he'd gotten stuck and couldn't think of anything. The professor was likable. It was the 60s, not having your creative juices flowing was understandable. Rudy could have until Monday to turn in his sonnet. We spent most of the weekend together, writing it, actually me writing down lines and crossing them off when they didn't scan or rhyme, and Rudy coming up with the ideas. It was the first pornographic poem I'd ever co-written. Of course I didn't know it was pornographic until Rudy explained to me all the word plays and double meanings. The coming of the spring upon the boughs, was the last line. That meant spring was ejaculating green leaves on the trees, the new crocuses were standing stiff on the lawn on account of they were turned on. I was shocked by all of this. I was a virgin, I wasn't 100% sure how sex worked. That anyone should put all of this into a poem, a place I'd reserved for deep feelings and lofty sentiments. I wonder now how much of Rudy's gutsiness was a veiled flirtation with me, who was obviously much taken with words and their meanings. I can't say, like I said, I hadn't learned yet some of the strategies one went through. But I was catching on. I remember the close of each of those weekend nights as a prolonged farewell. It would start by my noting the time, midnight, 1:30, and saying, "Well, I'm going to bed." Rudy would concur, "Me too," but then, he wouldn't move from his place at the foot of my bed next to my desk where I sat writing. It was a teensy dorm room. If you stood up to open the closet, you'd have to negotiate the desk so you wouldn't end up piled on the bed. "Me too." He smiled that ironic smile of his that always made me feel so foolish. Finally, I would just blurt out, "You've got to go, Rudy." He wouldn't say yes or no, or sorry to have stayed too long. He would just look at me with those bedroom eyes, and stand, as if he wasn't going out the door but coming in, both the old sense of the word and the new I had just learned, coming in from the cold outside for a night of lovemaking with his lady lay. We stood at the door. Then he leaned over and kissed me behind the ear for goodbye. It was that weekend too, at one of our lingering departure scenes, that I learned where he'd gotten his odd, ornate name. He'd had this crusty old grandfather he'd never met, from Germany, who'd left his unborn grandchild a trust fund with the proviso that he be named after the old man. What if you'd been a girl? I wondered. I wouldn't be having so much fun, Rudy said. By this time the kisses had migrated from behind my ear to my neck. I shivered when he put a necklace of them around me before departing. Our next workshop, no one understood what my sublimated love sonnet was all about, but Rudy's brought down the house. Suddenly, it seemed to me, not only that the world was full of English majors, but of people with a lot more experience than I had. For the 100th time, I cursed my immigrant origins. If only I too had been born in Connecticut or Virginia, I too would understand the jokes everyone was making on the last two digits of the year, 1969, I too would be having sex and smoking dope. I too would have suntanned parents who took me skiing in Colorado over Christmas break, and I would say things like "no shit," without feeling like I was imitating someone else. Rudy and I began seeing each other regularly that spring. Besides class, We ate all our meals together, and on weekends, he'd ask me over to his dormitory for parties in his hall. His dorm was next to mine, the two buildings connected by an underground lounge which would fill weekends with good-natured, clean parties, much monitored by security. The real parties went on in the men's dorms. Mostly guys migrated from one room to another, smoking a little dope, drinking a lot. There were the heavy rooms for dropping acid or taking mushrooms. Candles flickered, incense burned in an unsuccessful attempt to cover the pungent smell of marijuana. The Beatles or Bob Dylan or the Mamas and the Papas blasted from stereos. It was a decadent atmosphere for me whose previous experience of dating had been mixers and parlor calls from boys at prep school. I'd go over to Rudy's, but I would drink only a sip or two of the Dixie cup he offered, and I wouldn't dare touch the drugs. I was less afraid of what they would do to my mind than I was of what Rudy might do to my body while I was under the influence. He pooh-poohed my fears. For one thing, he said, without my consent, he couldn't do anything. What about rape? I asked. I wasn't a total bumpkin. Jesus Christ, he said, shaking his head, disbelieving what he'd let himself in for with me. I'm not going to fucking rape you. I was hurt. I'd never been spoken to that way. If my father had heard a man use such obscenities before his daughters, he would have asked him to step outside where he would have defended my honor. Of course, I would have had to do a lot of explaining afterwards about what I was up to at midnight on a Saturday night in a man's dormitory with a cigarette in one hand and a Dixie cup of cheap wine in the other. After some time in his buddy's room sitting in clusters, guys and their dates, Rudy and I migrated to his room. His bed was a mattress on the floor, the American flag draped over it for a coverlet, which even as a non-native, I thought most disrespectful. We would lie down under it, side by side, cuddling and kissing, Rudy's hand exploring down my blouse. But if he wandered any lower, I'd pull away. No, I'd say, don't. Why not? He'd challenge, or ironically or seductively or exasperatedly, depending on how much he'd imbibed, smoked, dropped. My own answers varied, depending on my current hang-ups. That's what Rudy called my refusals, hang-ups. Mostly I was afraid I'd get pregnant from getting felt up. Rudy said with sarcasm. Rudy, I'd plead, don't say it that way. What do you mean, don't say it that way? 7. A spade's a spade. This isn't a goddamn poetry class. Perhaps if Rudy had acted a little more as if lovemaking were a workshop of sorts, things might have moved more swiftly toward his desired conclusion. But the guy had no sense of connotation in bed. His vocabulary turned me off even as I was beginning to acknowledge my body's pleasure. If Rudy had said, "Sweet lady, lay across my big, soft bed and let me touch your dear, exquisite body," I might have felt up to being felt up. But I didn't want to just be in the sack, screwed, balled, laid, and fucked my first time around with a man. Rudy did have a honeymoon of patience with me at the start. He must have realized from his having had to explain to me so many references in his sonnet that I didn't know, as he put it, worth shit. To me, vagina, cervix, ovary were synonyms. Via diagrams he introduced me to my anatomy. He drew the little egg going down its hourglass into the sticky pocket of the uterus. He calculated when I'd last had my period, when I'd probably ovulated, whether a certain night was a safe time of the month. You're not going to get pregnant. All his lessons ended with the same point. But still I didn't want to sleep with him. Why? What's wrong with you? Are you frigid or something? Now there was a worry. I'd just gotten over worrying I'd get pregnant from proximity, or damned by God should I die at that moment, and now I started wondering if maybe my upbringing had disconnected some vital nerves. I just don't think it's right yet, I said. Jesus, we've been going out a month, Rudy said. When's it going to be all right? Soon, I promised, as if I knew. but soon didn't happen soon enough. We had progressed to where I stayed the night, waking up early in the morning, not daring to move for fear I'd wake Rudy up in an amorous mood and end up in an early morning discussion of why not now. I scanned the room, as small as mine. Beside his bed I could see the pad with the hourglass shapes. I touched my belly to make sure I was still intact. On the cinder block wall opposite the bed, Rudy had put up a bulletin board. There were pennants from his ski teams and photos of his family, all lined up on skis on top of a mountain. His parents looked so young and casual, like classmates. My own old world parents were still an embarrassment at parents' weekend, my father with his thick mustache and three-piece suit and fedora hat, my mother in one of her outfits she bought especially to visit us at school, everything overly matched, patent leather purse and pumps. That would go back, once she was home, to plastic storage bags in her closet. I marveled at his youthful parents. No wonder Rudy didn't have hang-ups, no wonder his high school acne hadn't left him riddled with self-doubt, his name hadn't cowed him. They encouraged him, his parents, to have experiences with girls but to be careful. He had told them he was seeing a Spanish girl, and he reported they said that should be interesting for him to find out about people from other cultures. It bothered me that they should treat me like a geography lesson for their son. But I didn't have the vocabulary back then to explain even to myself what annoyed me about their remark. I met them only once right before spring break, and ironically at the very close of my relationship with Rudy. What happened was the night before break started, Rudy and I had another one of our showdowns in his bed. Rudy turned on the light and sat up on his mattress, his back against the wall. He was nude, in my old long-sleeved flannel nightgown Rudy called a nungown. From the moonlight and street light coming in through the window, I saw his body beautifully sculpted by light and shadows. I did yearn for him, but I yearned for so much more along with that body, which I must have sensed. Rudy would never give me. He was worn down with frustration, he said. I was cruel. I didn't understand that unlike a girl, it was physically painful for guys not to have sex. He thought it was time to call it quits. I was tearful and pleading, I wanted to feel we were serious about each other before we made love. Serious? He made a face. How about fun? Fun, you know. What did that have to do with this momentous rending of the veil, I wondered. You mean you don't think sex is fun? Rudy faced me as if he were finally seeing the root of the problem. Sure, I lied. It's fun if it's right. But he shook his head. He had seen through me. You know, he said, I thought you'd be hot-blooded, being Spanish and all, and that under all the Catholic bullshit, you'd be really free, instead of all hung up like these cotillion chicks from prep schools. But Jesus, you're worse than a fucking Puritan. I felt stung to the quick. I got up and threw my coat over my nightgown, packed up my clothes, and left the room, half hoping he'd come after me and say he really did love me, he'd wait as long as I needed to after all. But he didn't slip into my room and under my sheets and hold me tight against the empty, endless night. I hardly slept. I saw what a cold, lonely life awaited me in this country. I would never find someone who would understand my peculiar mix of Catholicism and agnosticism, Hispanic and American styles. Had I been raised with the tradition of stuffed animals, I would have hugged my bear or stuffed dog or rabbit, salting the ragged fur with my tears all night. Instead, I did something that even as a lapsed Catholic I still did for good luck on nights before exams. I opened my drawer and took out the crucifix I kept hidden under my clothes, and I put it under my pillow for the night. This large crucifix had been a security blanket I took to bed with me for years after coming to this country. I had slept with it so many nights that finally Jesus had come unglued, and I had to fasten him back on his cross with a rubber band. Rudy did not come calling the next day. I bumped into him as he was leaving with his parents and I was exiting my dorm to take the taxi to the bus to my parents in New York. I was sleepy and weepy and did not look back when I felt Rudy's eyes on me. His parents did most of the chatting, talking too slowly to me as if I wouldn't understand native speakers. They complimented me on my accentless English and observed that my parents must be so proud of me. When we said goodbye, I did glance up at Rudy, and though I was out in the cold, he was still in the bedroom with the look in his eyes. After break, I didn't see much of Rudy. He didn't sit by me in class. His workshop poems became unaccountably straightforward and affectionate, out-and-out love poems. Was he trying to say he really had fallen in love with me? Then why didn't he stop by my room anymore? I started making excuses for him in my head. He had been there, but I wasn't in, and then he was too afraid to leave a note. He was too shy to come sit by me in class. Afraid, shy. Rudolf Broderman Elmenhurst, III. How we lie to ourselves when we've fallen in love with the wrong man. Of course, I could have sought him out and told him how I felt about him. How I was frightened of sex with a man who called it getting laid. But I was still in the mode where the guy did all the courting and seeking out. I kept aloof, I waited, I fantasized, misleading myself. The copies of my poems Rudy handed had on them brief, inane remarks I read and reread for double meaning. Good/or I don't get this line or nice details. My copies of his poems went back to him with long, complimentary comments. I became more and more of a recluse, avoiding our old haunts for fear of running into him. But we rarely bumped into each other, and when we did, he always flashed me his cool, ironic smile and greeted me with an offhand, "How you doing?" I, on the other hand, was bristling. With so much feeling, I pretended not to have seen him. Spring dance approached. I don't know why I still thought Rudy would certainly end up going with me. This was the culminating romantic event of the school year on campus, and it seemed to me in my fantasy mode to be the perfect vehicle for our reconciliation. I played it out in my head. We would dance all night. We would talk and confess how much we had missed each other. I would go back to his dorm room with him. We would make love, my first time, and then, almost as if they were the different positions Rudy had told me about, we would screw and fuck and ball and get laid, all the synonyms Rudy preferred for referring to his sex. In real life, the day approached, and then the night, and I was still hoping. The dance was in the lounge between the two dorms, and so, when I heard the band start up, I wandered down the stairs to a landing where I could watch, unobserved, the partiers. They were a motley group, the conservative frat guy types in tuxedos and their dates in fancy prom dresses, the new hippies in Indian paisleys, jeans, and sneakers, and maybe for flair, an incongruous bow tie. I saw the figures dancing luridly. The lights flashing, the band going. They all seemed so caught up in a rhythm I didn't feel a part of. Then I saw Rudy come into the room, a glass in one hand, no doubt full of something spiked with alcohol or acid. My heart would have fluttered if there had been any time between the initial glimpse of his familiar figure and the sight of another figure clinging to him. I could hardly tell what she looked like, who she was, but by the way they were holding onto each other, leaning into each other's bodies, I knew, first off that she was the beloved of his poems, and second of all the beloved of his bed. Within weeks of breaking up with me, I was crushed. For the second time in our relationship, as a kind of closing frame to our first meeting which had ended in my flight out of the classroom, I fled up the stairs. There's more to the story. There always is to a true story. About 5 years later, I was in grad school in upstate New York. I was a poet, a bohemian, etc. I'd had a couple of lovers. I was on birth control. I guessed I'd resolved the soul and sin thing by lapsing from my heavy-duty Catholic background, giving up my immortal soul for a blues kind of soul. Funky and lowdown, the kind inspired by reading too much Carlos Castaneda and Rilke and Robert Bly and dropping acid with a guy who claimed to be my cosmic mate from a past life. I got this call one night from Rudy. His parents lived just down the road, and he had read that I was at the neighboring university in the alumni bulletin. Could he come over to see me? Sure, I said. When? Tonight, he said. Tonight was already about 9:30. Up to his same old tricks. But I was taken with the guy's persistence. Sure, I said, come on over. He came on over. Brought an expensive bottle of wine. At the door, I gave him a friendly hug, but he held on for longer. I got nervous and gabby. His bad boy always drove me to my vivacious good girl. I sat him down in my one chair and started to quiz him on his 5 years since graduation. He sighed a lot, stretched his legs, cracked his knuckles. Finally, he cut me off, said, "Hey, Jesus Christ, I've waited 5 years, and you look like you've gotten past all your hang-ups. Let's just fuck." I threw him out. It still offended me that he didn't want to do anything but screw me, get that over with. Catholic or not, I still thought it a sin for a guy to just barge in 5 years later with a bottle of expensive wine and assume you'd drink out of his hand. A guy who had ditched me, who had haunted my sexual awakening with a nightmare of self-doubt. For a moment as I watched him get in his car and drive away, I felt a flash of that old self-doubt. On the counter, he had left behind a bottle of wine. I had one of those unserious, cheap, grad school corkscrews. Those days we bought gallon jugs of Gallo with pull-out corks or screw-eat-in lids. I worked the corkscrew in as far as it would go. I wasn't very good at this. Each time I yanked the screw out, I got a spurt of cork, but the stew remained snug in the bottleneck. Finally, I worked it in so I could see the sharp point of the spiral through the glass neck at the bottom of the cork. I put the bottle between my legs and pulled so hard that not only did I jerk the crumbled cork out but I sprayed myself with pensive Bordeaux. Shit, I thought, this is not going to wash out. I held the bottle up to my mouth and drew a long messy swallow, as if I were some decadent wild woman who had just dismissed an unsatisfactory lover. I-970 I-9060. A regular revolution. Kayla, Sandy, Yo-Yo, Fifi for 3 going on 4 years. Mommy and Poppy were on green cards, and the 4 of us shifted from foot to foot, waiting to go home. Then Poppy went down for a trial visit, and a revolution broke out, a minor one, but still. He came back to New York reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, and saying, "I am given up, Mommy. It is no hope for the island. I will become un Dominican York." So, Poppy raised his right hand and swore to defend the Constitution of the United States, and we were here to stay. You can believe we sisters wailed and paled, whining to go home. We didn't feel we had the best the United States had to offer. We had only second-hand stuff, rental houses in one redneck Catholic neighborhood after another, clothes at round robin, a black and white TV afflicted with wavy lines. Cooped up in those little suburban houses, the rules were as strict as for island girls, but there was no island to make up the difference. Then a few weird things happened. Carlo met a pervert. At school, epithets, spick, greaseballs, were hurled our way. 107. Some girlfriend of Sandy's got her to try a Tampax, and Mommy found out. Stuff like that, and soon she was riding away to preparatory schools, all girls ones, where we would meet and mix with the right kind of Americans. We ended up at school with the cream of the American crop, the Hoover girl and the Haynes twins and the Scott girls and the Reese kid who got incredible care packages once a week. You wouldn't be as gauche as to ask, "Hey, are you related to the guy who makes vacuum cleaners?" You could see all those attachments just by the way Madeline Hoover turned her nose up at you. Anyhow, we met the right kind of Americans all right, but they didn't exactly mix with us. We had our own kind of fame, based mostly on the rich girl supposition and our own silence. Garcia de la Torre didn't mean a thing to them, but those brand-named beauties simply assumed that, Like all third world foreign students in boarding schools, we were filthy rich and related to some dictator or other. Our privilege smacked of evil and mystery, whereas theirs came in recognizable pantyhose packages and candy wrappers and vacuum cleaner bags and Kleenex boxes. But hey, we might be fish out of water, but at least we had escaped the horns of our dilemma to a silver lining, as mommy might say. It was a long train ride up to our prep school in Boston, and there were guys on that train. We learned to forge mommy's signature and went just about everywhere, to dance weekends and football weekends and snow sculpture weekends. We could kiss and not get pregnant. We could smoke and no great aunt would smell us and croak. We began to develop a taste for the American teenage good life, and soon, Island was old hat, man. Island was the hair and nails crowd, chaperones. And icky boys with all their macho strutting and unbuttoned shirts and hairy chests with gold chains and teensy gold crucifixes. By the end of a couple of years away from home, we had more than adjusted. And of course, as soon as we had, mommy and poppy got all worried they were going to lose their girls to America. Things had calmed down on the island and Poppy had started making real money in his office up in the Bronx. The next decision was obvious. We 4 girls would be sent summers to the island so we wouldn't lose touch with La Familia. The hidden agenda was marriage to homeland boys, since everyone knew that once a girl married an American, those grandbabies came out jabbering in English and thinking of the island as a place to go get a suntan. The summer plan met with annual resistance from all 4 of us. We didn't mind a couple of weeks, but a whole summer? Have you got anything better to do? Mommy questioned. Like yes we did, if she and Poppy would only let us do it. But working was off limits. A boss hiring a young girl was after one thing only. Never mind if his name was Hoover. Summertime was family time. Big time family time, a whole island of family, here a cousin, there a cousin, everywhere we turned a kissing cousin was puckering up at us. Winters whenever one of us got out of line, mommy and Poppy would march out the old maybe what you need right now is some time back home to help set you straight. We'd shape up pretty quick, or pretend to. Sometimes the parents upped the ante. It wouldn't be just the bad daughter who'd be shipped back, but all 4 girls. By the time the 3 oldest were in college we all started out at the same all-girls one. Of course we had devised as sophisticated and complicated a code and underground system as Poppy had when he and his group plotted against the dictator. The parents' habit was to call us on Friday or Saturday nights around 10 right before the switchboard closed. We took turns on duty to catch those calls. But mommy and Poppy were like psychic. They always directed the first call to the missing daughter, and when she wasn't in, they'd ask to talk to another missing daughter. The third, on-duty daughter would get the third call, in which the first question would be, "Where are your sisters?" At the library studying or in so-and-so's room getting tutored on her calculus. We kept most things from the old people, but sometimes they caught on and then we rotated the hot seat. Fifi was on for smoking in the bathroom. She always ran the shower, as if smoking were a noisy activity whose hullabaloo she had to drown out. Carla was on for experimenting with hair removal cream. Mommy threw a fit, saying that once you got started on that road, there was no stopping, the hairs would grow back thicker, uglier each time. She made it sound like drinking or drugs. Yo-Yo was on for bringing a book into the house, our bodies, ourselves. Mommy couldn't quite put her ringer on what it was that bothered her about the book. I mean, there were no men in it. The pictures all celebrated women and their bodies, so it wasn't technically about sex as she had understood it up to then. But there were women exploring what their bodies were all about and a whole chapter on lesbians. Things, Mommy said, examining the pictures, to be ashamed of. Sandy was on when a visiting aunt and uncle dropped in for a visit at college early Sunday morning. She wasn't back yet from her Saturday night calculus tutorial. It was a regular revolution, constant skirmishes. Until the time we took open aim and won, and our summers if not our lives became our own. That last summer we were shipped home began like all the others. The night before the trip, we sisters stayed up late packing and gabbing. Sandy called her boyfriend long distance and, with her back turned to us, whispered things like "me too." We got pretty punchy, imitating aunts and uncles and cousins we would be seeing the next day. Maybe it was a way of getting even with people who would have power over us all summer. We played with their names, translating them into literal English so they sounded ridiculous. Tia Concha became Aunt Conchel, and Tia Asuncion, Aunt Ascension. Tio Mundo was Uncle World. Paloma, our model cousin, turned into Pigeon, and for spite we surnamed her, accurately, Toad. Around midnight, Mommy came fussing down the hall to our bedrooms in those fuzzy slippers of hers with the bobby socks and a roller cap on her head. "That's enough, girls," she said. "You have all morning tomorrow. You need your beauty dreams." We turned our faces glum to reaffirm the forced nature of this trip. And she gave us the little pep talk on family and how important roots were. Finally she went back to bed, and to sleep. Or so we thought. We turned the volume down but stayed up talking. Fifi held up a baggie with dregs of greenish-brown weed inside. "Okay, vote time," she said. "Do I or don't I take it?" "Don't do it," Carla said. Her nightwear was the antithesis of Mommy's. In fact, Carla looked almost dressed up in her prim cotton nightgown. A yellow ribbon held her hair back from her face. "If we're caught at customs we're in a shitload of trouble. And remember, now that Uncle World's in government, it would be all over the newspapers." "Carla, you're such a priss," Sandy taunted her. "For one thing, now that Tio is a VIP, we won't have to go through customs. Security will whisk us off, the Mrs. Garcia de la Torres." She waved her hand with a flourish as if she were introducing us to King Arthur's court. "You could try the Catex trick," Yo-Yo suggested, thinking it would be nice to have a little pot to smoke when things on the island got dull. "Pile a layer of Catex above whatever you were trying to hide," the island cousins once advised her, and the officers would shy from probing. "Who uses Catex anymore?" Fifi asked. "Would Tampax work?" "Those guys probably wouldn't know what it was." Sandy slid one out of the box she was taking. She pantomimed an investigation, ripping off the paper envelope and trying to bite off the end like our uncles did their cigars. We burst out in the loud laughter we'd kept at bay since Mommy exited. Soon enough, there were footsteps down the hall. Just before the door swung open, Fifi, who was still holding the baggie of grass, tossed it behind a bookcase, where it lay forgotten in the haste of our final packing next morning before our noon plane. Not 3 weeks on the island had gone by when Mommy called. Tia Carmen came padding out to the pool to tell us our mother was on her way from New York and that she intended to have a long talk with us. Tia admitted that yes, something was amiss, but she had promised our mother not to say what. Tia was super religious, and we knew we wouldn't get it out of her if she'd given her word. By way of consolation, she counseled us to examine your consciences. We reviewed our recent sins with our girl cousins until late that night. All I can think of, Yo-Yo offered, was they opened our mail. Or maybe our grades came. Fifi suggested. Or the phone bill, Sandy added. Her boyfriend lived in Palo Alto. "I think it's really unfair to leave us hanging." Carla's head was fretted with clips and bobby pins as if she were wired up for an experiment. Her hair turned frizzy on the island, and every night she ironed it, then rolled it in a tubby, using her head as large roller. "Examine your consciences," Sandy said in a boogeyman voice. I have, Fifi joked, "and the problem isn't I can't find anything to worry about but that I find so much." We spent the rest of the evening confessing to our giggly, over-chaperoned